Hello and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. I'm your host Mansa, and today we're in New York with Comrade Erica. Hi, Erica.
Hello, Mansa. I'm very happy to be here.
Cool. Thank you for joining us. So, Comrade Erica, actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a member of the Spartacus League, the U.S. section of the International Communist League. I help lead the work here. I'm the national chairman of the group in the U.S. and contribute to the paper that we're about to discuss.
Okay, cool. Right. So in the US, we've just put out the latest issue of Workers' Vanguard. If you haven't already checked it out, do go to iclfi.org to read or download the issue and to subscribe to our press. So the main purpose of our conversation today will be to get into Trump and US imperialism. So we'll be talking about our understanding of the Trump presidency, what we think is in store for the working class and oppressed, and what's our message, what's our perspective for the working class, as well as taking a look a little bit at what the Marxist left is saying and doing and what we think is wrong with it. These three broad themes are also, they are essentially the three main articles on the domestic situation in Workers' Vanguard. So let's get right into it. Trump 2.0. There's immense hysteria about Trump and what he represents. Now, obviously, it's undeniable what Trump's mission is. It's to upend the liberal world order and shore up U.S. hegemony. But I would imagine that, if I'm not a leftist, it's quite difficult to make much sense of domestic and, of course, international events beyond that. I think the news cycle is getting really overwhelming. Workers' Vanguard has these three key articles that are seeking to kind of make sense of the situation for workers. So you've got an article called Why U.S. Imperialism Needs Trump. And in it, you write that Trumpism is not fundamentally about the personal characteristics of its leading figure, but rather the broader goals of the U.S. ruling class as a whole. So I guess my first question to you would be, could you lay out a little bit what is the main point of this article? And what do you mean about your kind of claims about what Trumpism is?
Sure. Well, that article is called Why U.S. Imperialism Needs Trumpism. And what we try to lay out is basically why has a wing of the U.S. ruling class looking to, the policies of Trump and his increased authoritarianism and really shift from the previous neoliberal status quo. Why do they need to kind of shake things up in order to keep U.S. imperialism afloat? U.S. imperialism has been in a bind, for a while, and there has been a steady decline that's been happening coming out of the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. The very factors that gave rise to neoliberalism and the strengthening of U.S. imperialism simultaneously are what compelled it to new heights is also what has undermined it.
Mm-hmm.
So things like offshoring or, deindustrialization, whole free trade economy that, allowed U.S. imperialism to really dominate economically the world are the very factors that, have propelled, a loss of industry here in the U.S. and, have impacted, economic growth of U.S. imperialism. And that's kind of what the ruling class is looking to try to fix. So it recognizes that, it was in a leading position and rapidly, that gap is closing. And the imperialists, if it kept going the route it was, the neoliberal order, it was in jeopardy of, losing it all. So it kind of needs to close that gap, put itself back on track of maintaining, back on track to maintaining its, economic dominance and hegemony. And so, in short, that's why they're looking to Trump. And in particular, they need to bring China to heel
Right.
as well. Not It won't just happen
Of
kind of
course.
peacefully.
Right.
And the US imperialists know that. And Trump, of course, knows that. And he's very clear, that his goals in increasing the industrial capacity in the United States is to prepare it for war. And so it's going to grave lengths right now with tariffs and et cetera, to industrialize key areas of the economy and production that are related to a war economy, things like steel, high tech,
Mhm.
and of that nature.
Okay, I think that leads me to kind of my next question, which is on the tariffs. I mean, everywhere you look, there's talk about tariffs. What country's next? How is it going to be impacted? How bad is the impact going to be? And as far as, I mean, this morning, Trump is still like standing strong in terms of, there's been recent downturn in the markets globally, but, he was like, well, I'm going to go ahead. You need to, like, people need to just be ready for whatever comes. And like, he's standing strong. So I guess my question is to explain to our listeners a little bit what's behind the strategy of imposing tariffs on the rest of the world. And I mean, you've kind of already touched on it. Like, that's kind of one of the ways to shore up domestic industry. But, I think if we step back a little bit, in many ways, the Biden administration also saw that they have a need to like shore up some industry. So let's like, why is the Trump presidency seeking this approach? Maybe is that like kind of a way to put the question?
Yeah, well, they're seeking, this approach really to get the, uh, U.S. imperialists, both rivals and its, allies, in line
Mm.
with the goal of the U.S. imperialists to, keep it as top dog, economically throughout the world. In fact, it's really just a way to kind of force, the government in various countries to, take on the burden of, shoring up U.S. imperialism and uh, kind of, closing, the gap that currently exists. And in terms of the economy, they want the, various, countries, around the world, neo-colonies and such to really, you know, um, pay to reconstruct,
Mhm.
you know, the U.S. economy.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess I do want to just maybe push a little farther here because I know that, and this is, speaking from my own personal experience, like many people, they're like, look at the big seven, look at the AI kind of thing, America's leading in it, and it's just onwards and upwards forever, right? Like you've got Tesla, Microsoft, blah, 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 all of these things. And many kind of like liberal political commentators will look to like, AI and tech as the future for like continued growth, etc. But you write in your article, in this section called Trump's Liberation is Upon Us, you write here that these protectionist policies are actually an admission of weakness on part of, I guess, US imperialism. So I guess, as Marxists, we understand like obviously the you can have like, gigantic, like you can have a soaring Wall Street, and the markets and so on. But at the end of the day, like what's really key is your actual industrial economic basis. So yeah, I guess my question would be like, could you explain a little bit like how this is an admission of weakness?
Sure. I mean, it's admission of weakness in terms of where U.S. imperialism is right now
Mm.
in the world economically. Usually and historically, governments use things like liberalism, spreading, finance, capital, imperialism would do that, like kind of in the name of freedom, peace, democracy, et cetera. But those kinds of things, for example, hasn't stopped, the rise of China's economy, which is, a direct threat to, maintaining its dominance. They've had to resort to pushing back by implementing things like tariffs or a more
Hmm.
protectionist stance towards in terms of dealing with other countries
Hmm.
and uh, what's kind of brought into the U.S. What they want to try to do is to, increase the productive growth of the United States,
Right.
which, has been on a continual decline for decades.
Yeah. And I think I've just been reading a little bit around China. I think I recently read somewhere that China's shipyards are capable of building 300 times the naval capacity of the Americans, and I think this kind of just goes back to your earlier point about like, well, in the drive to really squeeze and confront China, like the US needs to go on a war footing. That is why, in fact, I think the tariff thing is an admission of the weakness of the overall underlying industrial base. Okay, I think coming to the next thing, you mentioned a little bit like, liberalism, democratic values, and so on and so forth. Obviously, now both Trump 1.0 and 2.0, like there's overwhelmingly like there's a real attack on democratic rights. And I think if you look at like many corners of the left, they'll be kind of rife with being like, oh, well, fascism is here and so on and so forth. Now, I think in Workers' Vanguard, you guys speak about Bonaparte. So could you explain a little bit like how to understand the kind of increasing, the authoritarian kind of atmosphere? I mean, we've recently witnessed like the mass crackdown at Colombia, for example, the number of people being detained as they try to enter the US. There's like increasingly just like more and more fear. And what do you guys mean by Bonapartism, and how does that help us to understand like why again this is also part and parcel of like Trump's approach to shore up US hegemony?
Sure. I mean, I think when people look at Trump, they look at him as this really brash, in your face, rude, vile, disgusting person. But it's important to understand that Trump is just not some crazed individual. The U.S. ruling class just won't allow someone who is completely out of step with their needs and interests to take power of the U.S. imperial presidency. I think he represents a definite and dominant trend in the ruling class. And the way he goes about it, may not be what we're used to seeing, especially after decades of liberalism, being kind of in charge. But um, it's mainly a shock because, we're so inured kind of to the liberal backslapping and we're all in this together nonsense, which was all premised on U.S. imperialism being, at the top. And Trump is kind of uncouth and an asshole, but U.S. imperialism, is an uncouth asshole to the whole world.
Right.
And he's just, more honest and upfront, about it than the liberals were, or Biden is kind of, like we said in our previous articles, they're taking the mask off and
Right,
kind of
right, right.
revealing, what the aims and really goals are of imperialism in a very kind of direct way. And like, everyone saw like, what a jerk he was to Zelensky, who
Yeah.
I had, no tears for in the first place, but,
Yeah.
um,
But that was, I
but
think, like a real sign of national humiliation.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
And what it kind of represented was the, turn U.S. imperialism is making, which is kind of what we mean by Bonapartism
Mm.
and authoritarianism towards more naked, aggression, to strong arm,
Hmm.
other heads of the state, layers of the ruling class in the United States who may have preferred the liberal route and may not
Hmm.
like the direction Trump was going, and working class and the press to kind of keep them in line with what he has in store, which won't be good news. He kind of has to, implement these kinds of measures that
Hmm.
he has already started to do.
Okay, so you've laid out why it's U.S. imperialism that actually needs Trump. The kind of the strategy. This is not some aberration per se, but that it's actually in line with the interests of a wing of the ruling class. Now, I think the thing I'd like to talk about now is the working class, because obviously a lot of the working class in the US voted for Trump. I was watching his Liberation Day speech, and he had members from like some of the main unions there. Like I think it was the ILA or the Teamsters. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But you have workers who genuinely do buy the fact that, oh well, the tariffs, they're going to bring back the jobs to the US, and they're going to resuscitate these kind of like deindustrialized um, regions of the country. So I guess like when it comes to the working class, like what's the mood? Like what's actually happening in domestic kind of politics and class relations when we do talk about the working class? Yeah, what's the mood? And how do we kind of explain that, listen, this is strategy by US imperialism is actually not a good news at all, both for like workers in the US, but also just like internationally. So one, I guess, what's the state of the working class in the country? And then we can talk a little bit later about like what's the perspective that Marxists have for the working class in the country.
Sure. Well, by now everybody knows, that Trump winning the election, a large part, had to do with the working class's dissatisfaction and really repulsion over what have been their working conditions and overall standard of living after decades of Democratic Party rule and neoliberal rule in general. And one of the effects of that, you've seen, major industrial cities be, withered down to not non-existence because they do exist, but they're really a fraction of,
Right.
what they used to be. And you've seen great unionized jobs, um, and factories where those union members used to work just close up and shift to either the non-unionized south of the United States, but more likely what was the case was outside of the United States. And so Trump appeared on the scene and actually, was able to ride in based off that dissatisfaction and kind of anger in the working class over their conditions and say, hey, I'm going to come in, I'm going to reindustrialize, I'm going to bring jobs back, I'm going to get rich, and I'm going to make you rich right along with me, which many workers said they went for Trump because they remembered 4 years prior to the pandemic that they had a little more money than they had under the Biden administration. And Trump said, well, hey, I'm going to, get you back that
Right.
and much, much more. But just saying, as Trump is, that you're going to reindustrialize and make America wealthy again, well, for the working class, yeah, for who, right?
Right.
But just saying you're going to reindustrialize also doesn't make it so. So they've got to force the issue, and the way they've done it is with tariffs. And so workers may ask, well, why don't tariffs benefit me, right? And far from benefiting, the working class, it's going to cause great economic upheaval, and you're already kind of seeing that. Today, where they've already started to, cause prices to hike. Many workers in the last few days have received a letter from their, related to the retirement and 401ks being all up in the stock market saying, dear worker, things don't look good right now. And that's not very comforting, right?
Right.
To the class who's worked to the bone just to, have something, they're no longer able to work and be somewhat comfortable in this crappy society. But the bottom line is there's a major, recession that's around the corner, if not a full-blown catastrophic crisis. And really kind of what the working class is facing is lower wages, loss of jobs, and to the extent, that they're brought back to kind of shore up the U.S. to put it on war footing, they're not going to just the Trump and the administration or the ruling class is not going to just hand you kind of the high life on a silver platter. They're staunchly anti-union. Their bottom line goal is to increase the profit shares for, the bosses. And in order to do that, they're going to, squeeze the working class dry. They're not talking about reindustrializing and bringing union jobs at, top levels
Right.
of pay. Well, what the working class is going to be facing is, very low wage, non-unionized manufacturing and, a very bleak economic future.
Yeah, I guess this is a kind of the perfect transition to the headline of your front page article, which is Workers Brace for Impact. I guess you've already alluded to this in kind of how you've laid out like what the working class is facing. But I guess to step back a little bit, like could you tell us a little bit about like what's the state of like the working class and working class struggle in the country? Because I think in the last couple of years we've seen kind of important strikes happen. Boeing just happened several months ago. Before that there was a UAW. There's the ILA actually even went on strike, which is, quite something. So I mean there's been some strikes. At the same time they've not won. I think that's safe to say. So what's the state of the working class? And I think once we get a bit of a sense for the mood, how strong or how weak it is, then we can kind of be in a position to more meaningfully understand, like, what do you mean by bracing for impact? Because obviously it's undeniable that an impact is coming. But yeah.
Sure. I think when you look at the state of the working class, there are really two sides of it that I think are useful to look at. And one you just mentioned, which was the number of strikes and upheavals that we've seen in the United States in the past few years under the Biden administration. And some of those were quite militant strikes, like in terms of the workers' determination in staying out against the odds. Like the UAW or the Boeing strikes, even, the ILA strike, those workers were quite militant, who were out there for those 3 days, which shows on the one hand that the working class is not defeated in the U.S. But what's important to understand about that is that they weren't able to turn the tide in their favor in a circumstance that was a lot more favorable for them than it is now.
So really like a series of missed opportunities.
Completely.
Yeah.
I mean, what you had then, some of the we've sold and intervened in those strikes and Workers' Vanguard, putting it forward a different perspective and talked to a lot of workers during that time. And a lot of workers we encountered, some of the most militant ones that, weren't going for bullshit contract offers, for example, were, Trump supporters who, were very upset about, their working conditions, their wages, their futures, retirement, healthcare, all that stuff. It saw, you know, and saw the liberal establishment as who was responsible, and in fact, they were. So you had, this ferment and this anger, but then you had, the union leadership, from the UPSs, Sean Fain to the UAWs, excuse me, got that backwards, and the UPSs, Sean O'Brien,
Right.
the UAWs, Sean Fain, to Dennis Daggett and I'm going to say Eric Holden.
I have no idea what the Boeing guys. It's okay. Doesn't matter. The Boeing guy.
To the Boeing bureaucrat, who wanted to keep those battles, all of those strike battles in the confines of the liberal status quo that many workers were repelling against, and they didn't want to create a crisis for the liberal Democrats that they were attached to. And so you had, the bureaucracy who in each one of those cases undermined, and can't forget the ILWU either, right? Who undermined the strike or prevented workers from, fighting for what they deserve and subordinated those strikes to the Democratic Party and Biden's chances of later Kamala Harris's chances of, regaining the White House. They didn't want to, disrupt that vote, and those chances.
Absolutely.
And so what they did in the course of, showing this hand, to the workers is just repulse them even more and push them more into the arms of, the reactionary Trump administration. And so they really, what this misleadership of the trade unions did in each one of those struggles is to, sell out those struggles
Absolutely.
to the ruling class. And now what you have, them kind of, whatever, switching hats a little bit, although their mission is the same, they're still on their knees, to curry favor for the from the ruling class, but this time it's, the Trump administration, so people like Sean O'Brien or kissing Biden's butt, and I was kissing Trump's butt, faggots, and so on and so on. And then on the other hand, when you get to the state of the working class, right? So you have, the unions aren't huge in this country, but they have the real potential to be quite powerful. Key strategic industries are unionized, like we mentioned, some like longshore, and that really kind of any type of ferment, could really, stop the flow of commerce.
And not to mention the weapons, to Israel and Ukraine and so on.
Put a real wrench in their whole system. So that's what, those strikes had the ability at that time to turn the tide. But they were, not just for workers here, but, as you just alluded to, for, the Palestinian people who are being, kind of basically obliterated, by the Zionists, with the full backing of the U.S. imperialists, throwing a wrench in the imperialist whole operation, whether that's, shipping goods to the U.S. or weapons to the Israel, could have really changed things more in favor of the working class. But the working class in the U.S. in particular, or also in the unions, are also in a weakened state. So that's kind of the other side, right?
So they're not quite defeated, but they're definitely weaker. I mean, which is, I think, kind of makes sense. If there's been a number of key battles and they've not led anywhere, then the mood, I think there would be probably a little bit of demoralization, I would assume.
Yeah, there is that, in terms of being in a weakened state. But really, and that's kind of what the article, Brace for Impact kind of tries to address, is they're in a weakened state because of the divisions that exist in the class that the bosses and the trade union bureaucrats have, kind of enforced and sold. And so they're substantially weaker than they could be. And because of those divisions. And so there's a pressing need if they're going to kind of survive, in terms of the upheavals that they're in, the attacks that are all coming down the pike and have already started to. There's a pressing need to build, a real working class collective to mount the best defense, which really kind of requires breaking down the divisions in the class, the divisions over tiers, the divisions over crafts, the racial polarizations, the things that keep workers at each other's throats instead of, united against, their common enemies.
Right. Which brings me, I guess, to, the key points of your front page article. Bracing for impact. So, okay, we've established that, listen, major crisis coming. Trump is, in fact, a necessity, of a U.S. imperialism and not a friend of the working class, no matter even if they've voted for him. And what workers need to do is to brace. So I guess to that end, you guys have four key sections, right? You've got working class cohesion, which you've already talked about a little bit. And you've got a section called Isolated, We All Go Down, Organize the Unorganized, and Beware of the Misleaders. I think you've, again, just spent the last few minutes talking about the trade union leadership and really misleadership, actually, just to show that how they're complete, it's like they're terrified of actually letting the struggle approach the limits, right? Because it will totally threaten their relations with the ruling class. It'll totally threaten their own material positions. It'll threaten kind of the status quo. So I guess I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about, again, because for a non-American audience, about kind of the nature of the divisions plaguing the working class here today, but also kind of probably not just a today question, but maybe generally, right? I guess, the Black question here, race is obviously a huge one, but you've spoken about tiers a little bit. I think some of our listeners who are not so familiar with the US may wonder what that is. So one, I guess it's what's kind of the nature of these divisions, if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And obviously cohesion, but I guess what's the barrier to cohesion? right?
Yeah, well, I think the main barrier to the cohesion are the divisions I
Hmm.
discussed, and
Yeah,
also the trade union misleadership.
yeah, for sure.
And certainly the divisions that existed in the working class did not just appear under
Right,
Trump.
for sure.
They carefully cultured, let's say, by the bourgeoisie
Hmm.
for quite some time.
Hmm.
And I think one of the key divisions that you just touched on a little bit
Hmm.
in terms of racial divisions and Black oppression, um, you know, for the ruling class, the kind of division between black and white has been fostered, in this country from the very beginning. It's the key way that the American ruling class, has been able to keep,
Hmm.
the working class separated and incapable of,
Right,
because of this barrier, this false polarization, incapable of uniting to really take on their common foe that's, on the one hand responsible for racial oppression, keeping Black people at the bottom, segregated in the society, and on the other, wage exploitation. And so what the ruling class has done, this kind of divide and conquer strategy that they employ, is to tell one layer of workers that they could get more, they could benefit better,
hmm,
if another layer is
right.
kept down.
Hmm.
And they do that in various ways. One is through kind of, outright, racial oppression, where you see many Black and brown people in this country, earning the like lowest wages and, et cetera. And you have, higher, paid jobs or higher craft jobs that are, regulated, white workers. And
Right,
white workers are told, well, if you bring up that lower level to your standard, well, guess what's going to happen? You're not
right.
going to get yours, right? So we kind of want to break through those barriers that
Mhm.
exist. I mean, what's necessary is, a collective fight to bring the standard of living up,
Absolutely.
for all workers. And you also mentioned kind of tiers for our audience outside of the United States. I mean, it's a way to get away for the ruling class to kind of get away with, paying workers and keeping them divided. They have these different kind of classifications of, in many cases, workers doing the same jobs, but for less pay because they haven't paid their dues in the
Right.
boss's eyes enough to
Hmm.
kind of move up to, a higher tier. And so they're also broken down into craft divisions. You have some workforces that, are divided, one kind of industry, is divided into like 5 different unions where,
Yeah.
and within those different unions, there are like multiple different craft
Mm.
divisions, different, tier classifications, et cetera. And, in addition to kind of, different tier divisions, you also have things like, just straight up racial segregation within the workforce, where, industries like East Coast Longshore, in Newark, right in New York City's backyard in this day and age, have separate white and Black locals,
Which,
union
when I first learned
locals.
about that, blew my mind.
But what does that do? That, it kind of serves to weaken the collective strength of the union. It keeps them pitted at each other, to kind of move up and keep them at each other's throats, kind of like I said. And sort of what we try to focus on in the article, is kind of the individualist mentality that
Mm.
exists in the working class, whereas, the worker was like, hey, well, I'm just, it kind of sucks that, these workers and new hires and these lower tiers are doing the same backbreaking job that I'm
Hmm.
doing, aren't getting paid as much. But if I say something,
Right.
I gotta, hold on to my own. And,
Hmm.
that sucks for them, but I gotta look out for myself.
Hmm.
And really, kind of with what we're facing with, um, in this coming period, it's gonna be disastrous if the working class
Right.
is splintered, into the various divisions that it currently exists and unable to collectively push back.
Right. And I think the kind of problem is that as things get worse, that tendency to kind of just save your own hide is going to get, even more stronger, which I guess is the kind of logical transition to the left, right? Because the left is supposed to be the force that fights for the working class. What has the left been saying? What have they been doing, I think, with respect to understanding this period, but also like what do they have to say to the working class? Before I go there, though, I mean, I think I'd like to hear your views. After I guess months of Trump being formally elected, we finally saw like the first protests against Trump a few days ago. You also have got Bernie Sanders and AOC tour, the Fighting Oligarchy tour. So I guess like before we get into the Marxist left and what's wrong there, let's talk a little bit about like what's the state of the resistance, so-called, to Trump. Like, do you see a future for it? What's the nature of it? Like, is this kind of just like a bit of a gasp, or do you feel like it's got some potential to go somewhere?
It has a potential to go somewhere if it's completely rebuilt anew.
Not the Fighting Oligarchy tour.
And that's unfortunately what the Marxist left is calling for. Definitely not, the road that's necessary to take won't be found in the oligarchy tour. I think currently the left is completely disoriented and a bit delusional at that, and kind of pretending that we can just rebuild the liberal movements, to either 2006,
Right.
rights struggles, that existed then, or things like BLM that existed at the time, the Palestinian encampments and so on. And the truth is, the mainstream liberals are not interested in building movements to really defend the especially oppressed. And I think that hands-off protest you saw kind of confirmed that.
Why was it called hands off? I actually don't know.
Hands off our Social Security.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Hands off our federal jobs.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
And and really, I do think and it was kind of, very much a last grasp, I guess is the word, compared to kind of Trump's first term. What you kind of saw was, this was organized by the same people who did the Pussy Hat demos, for example, but, they weren't able to attract as many as, they did. 2017. But what I was saying about the hands-off protest, really it had nothing to offer, especially oppressed, at all. There was like kind of a bit of in social media, from many in the Black community who like looked at this protest and was like, well, it has nothing to offer us, It doesn't say, fighting against racial inequality, discrimination, police brutality, nothing, right? And, it didn't. Democrats, they're not, interested in trying to claim their space right now. In fact, they're not doing much, but based on a strategy that they know hasn't done them much good in the recent period. Problem with what the left is doing is that the liberal movements that they're kind of seeking to rebuild are incapable of achieving the goals in terms of fighting against the attacks and in the interests of the oppressed, because the movements that they want to rebuild were completely hitched to the ruling class. Why things, liberal movements, like BLM or like, many of the Palestinian demos that you saw last year were incapable of moving forward is because the the leadership of those movements never weren't about challenging the interests of capitalism's kind of what you confronting those interests is kind of what you have to do in order to push any of those struggles they claim to be fighting for forward, whether that's peerless interests or reflected abroad, or they're interests, here in the US in terms of things like decent housing, healthcare, all that requires going smack up
Right.
against the capitalist order.
All right. So, I guess, what about Bernie Sanders? He's finally like up and about saying a few things. What's your take on what Sanders is currently trying to do and trying to achieve?
I think Sanders is trying to rebrand the Democratic Party, the same ends as Trump, really, in terms of keeping U.S. imperialism afloat. He kind of didn't say as much in the article, but he's like, this is a tour to fight the oligarchy that, him and AOC
Hmm.
was also joined on. But what he just wants is kind of a different wing of the oligarchy,
Right.
to be in charge. So he wants to kind of dress up, or he has dressed up, Democratic Party politics and populist, um, rhetoric. So he's kind of for, state intervention, in terms of to kind of change things, for healthcare and the like, So he's similar to Trump in that kind of way in terms of wanting more state intervention, but,
Hmm.
but he wants to go about it just slightly different in a different kind of a way, but for the same purpose, which is to regiment the population and overhaul the economy to strengthen U.S. imperialism,
Hmm.
to pave it to be war ready as well, which was kind of the very motto of what he talks about wanting to redo FDR's. But he's very much a part of the same capitalist parties that have been responsible for screwing workers and they prosper decades, and he won't really fundamentally represent any type of a different challenge. And really, we're talking about him as if he's going to run in 2028. It's more likely, it looks like they're, kind of grooming AOC to
Yeah.
be that, person, but whether whoever it is, they represent the interests of
Hmm.
the capitalist ruling class. AOC, all the progressive Democrats,
Hmm.
squad, what have you, all do.
Hmm.
Um, it's kind of won't be any less problematic for the working class and no less reactionary either.
Hmm. I guess other than Bernie and AOC, like what's really, I think it's a question I find myself wondering, like where are the Democrats? Like what's happened to the Democratic Party? Like who are the main people now?
It seems, I mean, they're kind of,
Like maybe it's just me from the
sitting in the
outside.
alleys.
So you got Bernie AOC, just okay, fine, to the kind of darlings of the DSA and whatever. So Cory Booker, who's recently done his thing. But other than that, the Democrats seem like they're out to lunch. Am I right? Or am I totally just missing out on something happening in
I
American
think they're
politics?
pretty much defeated in terms of what's going on, but they're also very much in line with a lot of what Trump's doing
Oh yeah.
too, and you see that with their immigration, positions, and they very much want U.S. Imperialism to be shored up.
Hmm.
They don't like the way that Trump is going about it. They haven't. Yeah, you had Cory Booker speaking for 24 hours.
To what end?
Or you had Elon Omar,
Hmm.
speaking at this hands-off rally,
Right.
of course, not addressing, any of the fundamental questions that, the left have, tried to paint her as a champion of.
Right. And this is a point that I think we've been making in our press in the last few months, which is that you see that the liberals kind of everywhere really ditching the causes that they were really, promoting for years and years. I think the trans question is kind of a key example of that. I think the immigrant question also, I mean, absolutely. And I think this again, like, goes to show that, like,
Liberation, forget it. I guess they never really called for that.
but there was the moment like Pelosi did the whole kente cloth thing,
Yeah.
right? Like it's done. I guess that just like makes me think that, which is kind of the question that we started with, that U.S. imperialism needs Trump, and the flip side of that is also like there's really no room for liberalism anymore. Like if you're gonna go ahead and like really, if you're gonna go against China. And if you're going to go and like really try and shore up your hegemony, it's going to come at the expense of squeezing the rest of the world, whether it's your allies or, non-allies. And, that's much harder to do when you're simultaneously trying to like pull all this woke and like progressive stuff. So like the room for liberalism is also like just like absolutely narrowed. And I think this is for a future discussion, but I think, in Europe, for example, you really see like still like Macron, I think is a good example of like really holding on to like, oh my God, like European values and so on. But like things are about to hit these guys in the face where it's like, look, like, yes, okay, the US imperialist, its hegemony is kind of like, there's, our main article of our conference document is called A Breakdown of US Hegemony. Yes, okay, it's breaking down, but let's not get confused. It's still the top dog, and to stay on top, it's gonna like, there's no room for the same old kind of playbook of the last 30 years. Okay. So
yeah, I think that's a good transition to kind of really dealing with the left. Part of, why we titled this Dear Marxist Left, Wake Up,
right.
Wake up, is because, they're quite delusional in thinking that the current period where working class consciousness, has been thrown back, and we're facing, untoward, right-wing reaction and attacks, that this is a period of complete opportunity,
It's mental.
unbridled opportunity for the left, and so that on the one hand, and then the delusion of trying to rebuild movements.
And the same old kind of rotten programs.
Same old bankrupt, kind of crap. And I think there's some examples, right, that we give in the paper. People like, Kashama Sawant's Workers Strike Back, saying that, right now the working class is more progressive than ever.
Which I thought was really funny because from our work in the Boeing strike, like we literally met like pro-Trump union workers, at these rallies. Am I right?
Yeah, we did.
But also, I mean, if you just look like there is not just the working class, but also like Black and Latino workers also voted for the working class. And it's like,
I mean, one of the, main divisions that, we try to address in back to the article break, is completely applicable here in terms of what the left denies. And they're not the only ones, many on the left will, say, well, there's been a rightward shift and that, the Trump represents the end of, the liberal status quo and whatnot, but what they deny is the rightward shift within the working class and the class in general. What Trump has been able to kind of whip up amongst the working class and the oppressed. You mentioned Black and Latino voters. Some of them, did go out for Trump. People who you never voted for Republican in the past, showed up for Trump. He had like New York City, where we are right now, has been a completely, usually Democratic Party stronghold that Republicans didn't come out on top. They did far better than they've ever done before in this city, and so, and a lot of what's been whipped up is, immigrant kind of, hatred, that, here you have these, pool of workers from other countries coming in, taking our jobs, trying to move in our neighborhoods and things like that. And so Trump was able to kind of lay the blame for the, ills of, capitalist society, trying to point the finger, at immigrants, and people. And then you have the Democrats with their, sanctuary, cities, housing immigrants, neighborhoods, throughout the country that are barely getting by. And, and so people said, I hardly have nothing. And now you're sending immigrants in my neighborhood who are going to take away the little bit that I have. And so, Trump was really able to kind of foster that kind of coarseness in the class. And you kind of have to call it what it is. And it doesn't do any favors, for the left to, kind of, paint consciousness in rosy colors,
right.
And not only do they do that, but they, cling on to kind of this, moralism and, as a way to kind of, push, struggles like the fight for immigrant rights or trans rights, forward, based on, or browbeating of the working class.
Yeah,
How
yeah.
dare you have this anti-immigrant
Yeah.
movement
Which is one of the
instead of getting to
things.
the root
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah. Which is one of the things that pushed workers into the arms of Trump, because they're really sick and tired of this, like, being made to feel bad for
Yeah.
their views. I guess, especially, like, this is the same thing, same problem with the left in Britain as well, and I'm sure, like, in other sections or countries as well. But I guess the point I want to really drive home is that there's not, like, of course, there's a mistake in terms of how the left sees, like, kind of the shift in world relation, like, class relations and so on. Like, I think that's a mistake, but it's like this has implications, and that's why it's quite important. Like, it's not just like, oh, okay, well, we just got the mood of the working class wrong, but that's gonna have real devastating consequences. I guess if you could, like, take us a little bit into, like, why is that actually, like, a big problem?
Well, I mean, most of the left, talk about we need a workers' party, and workers strike back as workers in their name. I mean, you need to be able to win over the working class, to, to have a workers' party and not,
Right.
not to mention have it be, independent, from, both the liberal and right wing, politics of ruling class. And so really there's a need, I kind of started with a need to kind of rebuild the movements from the ground
Right.
up, on an anti imperialist basis, movements that, are prepared to go wholly against the ruling class ideologically and, position, workers, to be in a better place to, claw, to really put forward a fight and for what they need. And you won't find a road to the working class, based on those, liberal politics that a lot of the left either cling on or look to kind of rebuild those very same things that repulse, so many workers. And the working class, needs to be convinced that it's in their own material interest to, defend the especially oppressed groups like immigrants or trans, but it won't happen with that same moral suasion. It's not about, good, decent people, etc. Thing to do is to show why it's in their interest to, take up these causes, and kind of the left continuing to carry the stain of liberalism is only going to make that a near impossible task to do when when we're faced with really things going downhill.
I think the last kind of thing that I'd like to discuss is, now that we've talked about, okay, how to really understand Trump, to what's the impact for the working class, and three, why the Marxist left is kind of in a deep slumber and needs to wake up. So I'd like to bring it home and talk about, like, okay, well, what are the tasks for communists? If you got this understanding, right, that you've laid out in our discussion so far. So from this understanding, what does communist work in the US today and in the coming period look like?
Part of what we tried to do is to, and what we discussed here already, is to kind of really paint a sober picture, for the working class in terms of what they're faced with the economic chaos and turmoil that will really be raining on their heads in the upcoming period. And so, what is the task to put workers in a defensive position to kind of guard against, to be in the best position to guard against those tasks? And really, what's necessary for the Marxist left and for the working class in general is to kind of combat the racial and other antagonisms kind of that exist in the class at every turn. And to underscore the point that, what's necessary is to brace together to get as many layers of the working class together under one wing, and a unity of a purpose as possible. So, like, in terms of, fighting for, immigrant attacks, one of the things that we propose, in the Brace article is to organize, the unorganized, those very vulnerable layers, who are in large part, you know, um, immigrants, to bring them into the ranks, and in order to kind of enlarge and then to swell those ranks, kind of, strengthen the forces of the working class to enable them to kind of, stand down, some of the attacks, that are coming ultimately, what's our aim is to really kind of put the working class in control, of society, but to kind of, start by, putting them in the best place to be in charge of what's happening to them, right now in terms of, attacks on that against their unions or, that occur on the shop floor in their daily struggles, against the bosses who will be, doing things like speed ups and, slashing their wages to make up for the, price of tariffs and to kind of put them in a better position to, fight against what's coming in to kind of underscore why you need, really what we say in there is for the working class to be, one cohesive force in order to fight back, against those attacks. And we try to kind of show the way forward in terms of what's necessary to build these movements and to do it, in a different way that kind of exposes both the bankruptcy of liberalism and Trumpism for those who still, for those in the working class that have illusions in that. One of the things that we've done in the United States that we initiated a couple of years ago is our campaign to open the police archives
I was just going to ask you about
as
that.
a way to, fight back
Right.
against the rampant police brutality and menace and terrorization of, Black people in this country and brown people and others who've been, victims of police abuse. So we've, uh, started this campaign, which is a united front to take up these cases of police brutality and to push them forward in a way that'll bring other larger forces. With BLM is really the bankruptcy of liberalism and any liberal strategy, on full force. Every Black person in this country knows that BLM didn't give them shit, that, in fact, police brutality just, continues. And in fact, there were more people killed under Biden. BLM program just, ushered into office than there were, previously. Once Biden was in, what did all the liberals do who were out there, putting BLM on their business windows? I remember flying into JFK and I saw this big banner, Black Lives Matter. Really, that was like, kind of
Yeah.
they all have since, jumped wagon in terms of having any pretense to, fight for anything to alleviate, Black oppression in any kind of way, let alone championing cases of people who've been murdered by the police in this country. We've tried to reignite that movement in a way that, will appeal to the working class. I mean, it's kind of a basic thing, we want all the police archives open, to show really, the, true face of, the capitalist state and also the true face of the liberals and this whole system that, defends naked state terror. And this is something that, so far we've gotten some traction, from, workers, some unions, have supported, the campaign. The ILWU, for example, had some workers here in New York City, like the transit workers for
Transit workers for a fighting union.
yeah, like the transit workers for a fighting union, who, have come out in support of, the families of people who've been killed by the police. Today, in fact, we had a demonstration in the Bronx for Eric Dupre.
Right, yeah,
Or Eric Dupree. And to kind of, really shine a light on that case and to try to get broader forces involved. But it's been a kind of we've gotten, obviously support from families because we're showing them support and going out there and trying to really expose, for the world, to see, what happened to their kids, brothers, sisters, et cetera, at the hands of the police, and support their fight for justice, but in a way that exposes the betrayers of those fights. But in terms of it being an uphill battle, it's been kind of difficult to get, the rest of the left
Yeah.
On board with this.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part sectarianism and part opportunism. Honestly, they like, oh gosh, it's the Sparks. I don't want to have anything to do with them.
Right.
It's like, I'm not going to get dear left. We're not going to get anywhere based on sectarian methods. And in fact, there's a crying need. Many of these families have been left isolated, to
Absolutely.
and to carry, this burden on their own. Yeah, there were millions out in 2020, but like, where are they now?
Yeah,
You go to a lot of these demos, they're fairly small. It's kind of shameful that, the left should be really out there in mass, despite their differences. And yeah, if you have differences, that's fine. Let's talk about what strategy is needed. If you really think the whole bankrupt road of BLM is what Black people in the working class need right now to unite them and struggle in defense of Black rights and equality, explain. Let's talk about how those, movements have actually, completely undermined, the struggle for things like that.
I think, of course, I'm aware, like, some of the criticisms we face with regards to our Open the Police Archives campaign is like, oh, well, this is reformist work. What are you doing? You're just out here, like, trying to just, like, it's just reformist. You're just out here working with families and blah, blah, blah. But I think it's like, one, it's quite something for such groups. I won't mention any names, but it's quite something for such groups to make such criticism while having absolutely zero perspective of, like, why did BLM fail? Where is the Black struggle at? How should we rebuild it? Because it is an absolute urgency this very second to rebuild this movement. I don't know what my second point was, but I think it's kind of like super hypocritical of them to shun what we're trying to do, which is, I think, it's a concrete kind of example of how communists in this period, which is not a good period at all, are actually trying to champion the interests of, like, the most oppressed in society by recognizing, like, look, the movement's gone. And whether that's a Black question, the women's movement, whatever, the movement is gone. But you know what? The need remains. And so here's how we're going to build it. And like you said, like, if you have differences, like, let's argue them out, but let's at least try and do something concrete to rally the forces who are still looking for answers. These young Black militants who are in the street during COVID, I'm sure they're looking for answers, but it's like, well, one, the left doesn't have any. And two, let's rebuild this movement, because that's how you're gonna, come back to the overall kind of point of the paper, I guess, is like how to put the class in a better defensive position to face what's coming, right? So, yeah, that's my little rant. on OPA.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of demoralization that came as a result, of BLM. I think with BLM, you saw many people I knew who that was the first time ever going up to a rally or a march, only to be, led down the dead end of Democratic Party politics and liberal identity politics and all the things that, at lead the struggle for equality and against racial oppression to ruin.
Absolutely. Okay, I guess I'm out of questions if you've got anything more to add. But I guess I'll just finish by just motivating the issue more broadly. Like, I think it's an absolutely smashing issue, because you guys have also got recent articles on the big protests in Turkey against Erdogan. You've got a short article on Öcalan and Rojava, who've kind of just totally basically agreed to down their arms. It's a total capitulation for the Kurdish struggle. You've got articles on what's been happening at Colombia with Mahmoud Khalil, and you've got a lot of trade union copy. Again, I would encourage our listeners to go and check this out. But also, I think, some of the things you've really touched on in this discussion, we've got some key articles on the US. I think the last issue, it was Where's the US Going, right? To really understand, like, how did we get here? Like taking stock of US imperialism of the last 30 years, basically, and like how all of that has kind of paved the way for Trump today. Talking about BLM, there's a key article we published, I think, probably 2 years ago now, on BLM liberalism versus Trotskyism, and, other such great articles, including also on Puerto Rico, which is also quite key. And I think, as US imperialism really turns the screws, we're going to really see the repercussions kind of most graphically probably in Puerto Rico. So yeah, do go online, again, iclfi.org, to check out all of those articles and to subscribe and give us a follow. That's
Check out how to contact us.
Oh yeah, how to contact. All of that's on the website. And follow Workers Vanguard on X and Instagram at Workers Vanguard. And I think, yeah, that's it. So thanks so much for spending probably an hour talking to me. Yeah.
Thank you, Mansa.
Okay. Bye.
Forward to more Spark Talks.
All right. Bye.